Okay, we're looking today at our biology and our biography. So what is it about the way our brains and bodies work, and our story that interplays, in particular looking at the moral emotions of shame and guilt. Okay, and we're going to focus particularly on the needs of our younger students in this presentation. So to look at the neuroscience, to start with that, we understand that there are four parts to the brain and that they develop in sequence. The first most primitive part of the brain is the brainstem. Above that is the diencephalon, and then over that the parts of the limbic system, and finally the cortex and the prefrontal cortex, which makes us human. So if we look at those bits, the brainstem is the only part of the brain that needs to be fully developed at birth, because it controls our breathing and our heart rate, our temperature regulation, all of our physiological functions. It also has a key part to play in terms of getting sense information from the environment and detecting threat or challenge to us bodily. The diencephalon, which develops in the first 2 to 3 years of life, in particular, is the part that is responsible for movement and coordination, which is why it's during that period that the baby, the infant, learns to crawl and then walk and then develop fine motor skills and so on. Those two parts of the brain taken together are what we call the lizard brain or the reptilian brain. They're the most primitive part of the brain, the oldest part of the brain in evolutionary terms. And they would keep a body alive because they will move it around, they'll get it to find food and a mate and all the sort of bodily functions and living functions that an organism has to do. Over the top of the diencephalon is the limbic system, which is the seat of emotion. And this is particularly in mammals. This would now constitute the mammalian brain with those three parts. This is developed later. Now all of these parts exist in the brain at birth, but they're not fully developed and not fully evolved. The limbic system really comes into its own, starts to come into its own at the start of adolescence. So its development is triggered hormonally. And above the limbic system is the cortex, which is where we think. It's involved in learning and in particular executive function, predicting consequences, making decisions, those sort of things that kids are learning to do. The cortex makes us human. Gives us language and all that sort of stuff. Now, the brainstem, as I said before, is constantly on alert, looking for threats to the system, to the body. So it's continually passing information upwards to the limbic system and the cortex. It senses the temperature, whether we're comfortable or not, whether we're in pain or not, and it sends that information up to give us feelings and thoughts. But there's also a negative feedback loop down from the cortex that we can regulate, and this develops later in life, I suppose, that we can regulate to some extent how our more primitive parts of the brain send off alert signals. This, for the developing human being, the young person, is a constant balancing act between the brainstem and the cortex. And we've all encountered, and we all encounter on a regular basis, kids for whom this balancing act is difficult. And we know when the brainstem is taken over, when the kid is, out of control, he's not able to be reasoned with because the cortex is not in charge. We refer to that as an amygdala hijack, that the kid can't access the cortex at that particular point in time because everything else is so overwhelming. Lieberman and others found out that one of the ways of regulating that down is to name the emotion. And this works with adults too. That if you say to somebody, you know, I can hear you're really angry about that, the actual hearing the word angry in their cortex starts to do that negative feedback loop and quietens down the lower part of the brain. In some systems, you'll hear this referred to as the upstairs brain and the downstairs brain. That we want kids to be able to use their upstairs brain in the classroom, which is how they regulate the lower parts of the brain. Bruce Perry, the American psychiatrist and a neuroscientist, says that if we're trying to connect with somebody, then we can't reason until we relate, and we can't relate until the person is regulated. So when Johnny's screaming underneath the table, you can't reason with him to come out. You've just got to do something that enables him to regulate, or for you to co-regulate him, to calm him down, to stop the amygdala hijack, so that you can then get on to connecting with the limbic system and the cortex. Now, the development of the brain itself, Perry told us, is a use-dependent process. What we use, it's like developing muscles. What we use gets strengthened, and what we don't use doesn't. And there are windows of opportunities for the different parts of the brain for optimal development. I've said already the optimal development time for the limbic system, for the emotional system, is at the start of puberty. The optimal time for the development of the cortex is seen as somewhere around the high teens, somewhere around the 15 to 18 mark. And Perry says what's necessary, just like going to a gym for developing your body, what's necessary is repetition of patterns. Repetition of pattern neuronal activity is necessary to develop new neurons and to develop synapses, the connections between neurons. Whenever we learn something, whenever we're first able to do something, that's a new connection between the neurons. That's the synapses forming. And Perry reminds us that it's the repetition of the neural activity, the pattern neural activity that is involved in learning. This is why we repeat things in class. This is why we do things at spaced intervals and give kids revision and so on. So just as in learning our classwork, we learn to relate. We learn to connect between people. Now, if we just look back for a minute at the work we did on developmental relationships earlier in the year, well, last year, we saw that Perry told us that humans become humane. We develop the character, the skills, the abilities to relate interpersonally with one another, to be the sort of people we want our kids to be. We become that. We're not born that way. And we become that way as the result of innumerable interactions between more developmentally mature adults and us as young people as we're growing up. That each of us is the product of those millions upon millions upon millions of one-on-one interactions where the prefrontal cortex of a developed adult is interacting with the underdeveloped prefrontal cortex and limbic system of the young person. And we also had a look at the fact that one of the major things that's happened in the last couple of 100 years is the lengthening of adolescence. Adolescence is a time of great neuroplasticity and metaplasticity, development of the brain. But one of the things that's happened, and they say that adolescence begins in biology, begins at the start of puberty, and ends in society. That is, it ends when generally in our society kids have moved and become independent from the family home. Now in the 1800s, as we saw, that adolescence came from about 15 to 18 or 19. And what's happened in the 1950s, by the 1950s, the onset of puberty had dropped to about 12 to 13, and it's now recognised at around 10 in Western culture, in Western societies, that the onset of puberty is happening on average around age 10. And kids are now spending much more time at home, not leaving home until mid-20s. So adolescence is stretched out considerably. Now, in terms of brain development, there are three major systems that are developed during adolescence: the reward system, the relationship system, and the regulatory system. The rewards and relationship systems are the green light, they're the accelerator. And they start to develop with the limbic system. This is why it becomes important to kids what their friends think rather than what their family thinks, for example, because they're getting rewards out of the relationships outside the home. So this starts at the start of puberty, but the regulatory system, the executive function, the self-regulatory abilities of the higher cortex isn't tied to biology, it's tied to chronology basically, and it starts to develop around the 15 to 18 or 17 to 18 year old mark is where it really comes into its own. Now what that means is that with the lengthening of adolescence, with puberty becoming earlier and earlier, originally in evolutionary terms there were only a couple of years between when the kids got the accelerator and when they learned the brake. In other words, when they were really developing the reward system and relationship system, and when they were able to regulate that and self-regulate that. Now that we've moved, or now that it has moved, that the limbic system starts developing at around age 10, but the prefrontal cortex is still set in time around the 16, 17, 18 mark. There's a much larger gap for which kids have a very strongly developed reward and relationship system, but an inadequately developed regulatory system. And you might recall I said that it's during that period that we really need to be the prefrontal cortex for a lot of these kids. The focus here is on self-regulation and the ability to be aware of, to exercise control over our feelings, thoughts and behaviour. Steinberg, a psychologist who works with adolescents, says the capacity for self-regulation is probably the single most important contributor to achievement, mental health and social success. And in fact, in another text he goes further to say that, or to report that self-regulation turns out to be a stronger predictor of success in the classroom than intelligence, talent, or even previous standardized test scores. Marzano, Robert Marzano, says in the New Taxonomy that developing self-regulation should be a fundamental goal of education. So mid last year we talked about developmental relationships, what our responsibility was as the adult in the room to form relationships, and it's not just, we're not just talking about warm and fuzzy relationships here where everything's hunky-dory and nice in the classroom. We're talking about relationships through which we do our teaching, relationships in which our day-to-day actions contribute intentionally and deliberately to the young person's proper development. And they're an appropriate mix of press and care, as we saw then, that we had a two-dimensional field of practice, press on the vertical axis, challenge, push, expectations. On the horizontal axis, care, support, nurture. And what we were striving for was a high combination of press and care. And what makes a relationship developmental is that it enables the young person to discover who they are, to develop the abilities that shape their own lives, and to learn how to engage with the world. So it's an empowering relationship for the young person through which they develop neurologically and psychologically, and it's our day-to-day actions that help bring that apart. We also looked at the developmental relationship framework, which talked of 5 specific elements and 20 discrete actions. And the 5 elements were to express care, to challenge growth, to provide support, to share power, and to expand possibilities. And we did some work on those, and the staff teased out what some of the more concrete actions were that could go under these banners. Now, just finally on the neuroscience, if we look at that field of practice, the expectations on the vertical axis versus support on the horizontal axis, and this is very much the social discipline window of restorative practices, we know that a punitive approach is high on expectations or high on standards and low on support. And what that prompts neurologically is a vigilance for threat. The main part of the brain that's acting in a punitive system, for people in a punitive system, is the brainstem and parts of the limbic system. The cortex is not as strongly engaged. The brain is sitting in a state of what we call anxious vigilance. It's watching out for threat. It's watching out for danger. Am I going to get into trouble here? How do I stay out of trouble? And when the brain is primarily focusing on that, it's not able to use the cortex. It's not able to access memory and executive function successfully at all. With a permissive regime, one of the things that does is it connects negative behaviour with positive feelings. In other words, I do the wrong thing, but there's no consequence, that nobody challenges me about it. Which means I can do anything I like, which is a passive enabled brain state. And once again, it's largely the brainstem and the limbic system that are activated. Now, a neglectful one has a brain state of reactive defensiveness or defensive reactivity. It's ignored. It's neglected. As it says there, it's got a negative impact on attention, memory, emotions, and behaviour. It's certainly not accessing the cortex. According to Perry and others, and Saufler here, the restorative climate would regulate, relate, and reason, according to Perry, that 3-step process, and that engages the cortex and allows a relaxed alertness to the brain. It builds attunement and connection between teachers and students, and promotes executive functions, so things like cause and effect thinking, accountability, reflection. So the takeaway from this little segment on neuroscience is simply this: the power of relationships will always dwarf all other pedagogical strategies. We could say, and I did say, I think in the session I did on developmental relationships, that relationships are the language and the technology of our teaching. The computers aren't our technology. Our technology, the way we achieve our task in teaching, is through the relationship we have between ourselves and our class, ourselves and our students. So the power of relationships will always dwarf all other pedagogical strategies. In fact, John Hattie identifies this in his meta-studies, and he says that the teachers who are most successful, no matter what the pedagogical strategies are, the teachers who are most successful with those pedagogical strategies are the ones that focus first on relationship.